Wednesday, June 1st. Tonight on The National, summit pronouncements. Both leaders say they made progress, but hoped for more. Reserve anger. Indians block a major Montreal highway to protest a Mountie raid. And on The Journal, a summit success. On Saturday, this refusenik took to the street. Reagan took his case to Gorbachev, and now he's a free man. Tonight, Sergei's story. The National with Peter Mansbridge.
Good evening. Well, it's all over except the goodbyes. Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev are talking about their summit as mostly a success. Their meetings were perhaps bigger on symbols than on substance, no real breakthroughs, and the two men still disagree on issues such as arms control and human rights. But in a news conference, Reagan said the summit had eased their differences. At his own meeting with the media, Gorbachev talked about a watershed, a new era of nuclear disarmament. But the Soviet leader also criticized Reagan's approach. He said the summit could have accomplished more. Our coverage tonight begins with Don Murray.
In a summit of small achievements, this, for Mikhail Gorbachev, was the moment of satisfaction. The signing of his name to a ratified treaty abolishing all land-based intermediate nuclear missiles. He clutched the document and shook it triumphantly. And then he offered this sweeping view of the impact of his talks this week with Ronald Reagan.
Each of them made huge breaches in the Cold War fortress and opened up passages to modern, civilized world politics worthy of the truly new times.
Half an hour later, he met the media. It was a Gorbachev summit summary such as the world has come to know. Exuberant, verbose, frank, acerbic. For almost 2 hours, the words, the information, the opinions spilled out. He paused only long enough to redirect traffic.
Come on, change over.
Telling senior Soviet officials to leave their seats equipped with simultaneous translation devices.
Tom, what are you sitting there for? Come on, get up and change places if it's not working.
Then ordering foreign journalists to take their places so they could better understand him. Where the summit itself was concerned, it quickly became clear that Gorbachev was frustrated, annoyed with Reagan's emphasis on human rights here this week.
This is a part of the visit of this fourth meeting where propaganda gambits prevail and all sorts of spectacles. I'm not filled with admiration for this part of the visit. So let's get back to real politics.
But the frustration ran much deeper.
We have missed a chance to take an important step forward towards civilized relationships.
Gorbachev's litany was long. A treaty to cut offensive nuclear missiles by half. New talks to cut conventional armies in Europe. Expanded economic cooperation. All slowed or blocked, as he saw it, by American indifference or opposition.
Let me explain where I see this contrariness.
And then, tearing up the diplomatic rule book, he told of his efforts to get Reagan to sign a document with him, renouncing military force and embracing peaceful coexistence. It was a scathing sketch of a president overruled by his own advisors.
I gave the president both the Russian and English text. He read it, and he said, I like it. But when today we met in order to finalize the text of the joint statement, it turned out that not everybody likes it among those who surround the president.
Despite his public frustration, despite his critical comments, Gorbachev continued to talk of the possibility of a fifth summit with Ronald Reagan, but only if much progress is quickly made on a long-range missile reduction treaty. And that progress, Gorbachev suggested, now depends much more on the White House than on the Kremlin. Don Murray, CBC News, Moscow.
When the great communicator came to give his summation, he was on the defensive. He admitted that he had agreed with Mikhail Gorbachev on including the term peaceful coexistence in their communique, and then reneged.
I like the whole tone, the general tone of it.
But his aides saw it differently.
They studied it and saw where there could have been certain ambiguities, so some rewriting was done by our own people.
It was that way all the way. He rejected Gorbachev's accusations that his pronouncements on human rights were an interference in Soviet domestic affairs. His reason, 1 in 8 Americans is of Soviet or Eastern Bloc descent.
And so I have put it this way, that you don't stop loving your mother because you've taken unto yourself a wife.
And he explained his change of heart on the Soviet Union being the evil empire this way.
Well, a large part of it is Mr. Gorbachev as a leader, and I think there have been changes here as they have sought to make, well, I read Perestroika.
He rejected accusations that he's putting the United States at a negotiating disadvantage because he is in a hurry to get a long-range nuclear missile treaty before he leaves office next January.
No, I am dead set against deadlines.
Gorbachev has dominated the summit, and nowhere more so than on their walk in Red Square yesterday. Here was Reagan, the old crowd pleaser, being upstaged by the Kremlin commissar. Reagan had boasted that when he came to Moscow, he would outshine the Soviet leader. But in Red Square, hampered in part by the language handicap, he seemed most of the time a mute bystander. Tonight, at a gala performance at the Bolshoi Ballet, Reagan dozed off. That reinforced reports that he seemed lethargic, even sick. The persistent reports forced the White House to announce that the president was not ill, just tired. Late tonight, like any other tourists, the Reagans gravitated to Red Square to have their picture taken in front of St. Basil's Cathedral.
President, why have you come back to Red Square? Because Nancy had not seen it. We're leaving tomorrow. I didn't want her to miss it.
Reagan has charmed many Russians, and he has offended many others. None, though, could fail but notice the strong contrast between their energetic leader and the aging and fading American. It's a strong message that as far as Ronald Reagan has gone in abandoning his evil empire ideas, if the Russians expect another great breakthrough, they will have to wait for the next president of the United States. Joe Schlesinger, CBC News, Moscow.
While Reagan and Gorbachev were talking to the media this afternoon, their wives, Raisa and Nancy, were talking to each other. Well, sort of. There have always been stories that supposedly this is one relationship that the Soviet-American thaw hasn't yet hit. And there did seem to be some tension in the air this afternoon. Raisa Gorbachev planned to give Nancy Reagan a tour of the Tretyakov Gallery, home of the world's largest collection of Russian art. Mrs. Gorbachev began even before Mrs. Reagan arrived by pointing out some icons and speaking at length about their artistic value. Reporters later pointed out to Nancy Reagan that their religious elements had not been mentioned.
Well, I don't know how you can neglect the religious implications. I mean, they're there for anybody to see.
Later, as Raisa Gorbachev presented an album to reporters, Nancy Reagan seemed a little uncomfortable, and when her host tried to move the tour along, Mrs. Reagan spoke up.
I want to say something. Okay? All right.
Nancy Reagan's press secretary later said the two women are just from different worlds. All during this summit week, Soviets both inside and outside the Communist Party have been testing Gorbachev's new commitment to open debate. Today there were mixed messages. A few days ago, a former top party official, Boris Yeltsin, said publicly that the Kremlin's #2 man, Yegor Ligachev, should be fired because he opposes reform. Today at his news conference, Gorbachev said that's not so. He said Ligachev is staying and Yeltsin himself has some explaining to do. But some other criticism from the Communist Party's opponents was allowed to go ahead without interference, and that may be a first. About 50 people trying to form a new political party organized an open protest. David Holton was there.
It was a sight many observers here said they had never seen before, a demonstration by some of the strongest opponents of the Soviet system that wasn't broken up by Moscow police. A one-party system leads to totalitarianism, this man said. A similar demonstration in Leningrad last week by the same group, the newly formed Democratic Union Party, was stopped by police within minutes. But today, all the police did was appeal to the crowd not to block the sidewalks. They didn't make the slightest effort to interfere with demonstrators, carrying placards such as "Democracy, not bureaucracy," and "Free the political prisoners." Nor did the police try to stop Democratic Union leaders from promoting their party platform. We want the right, he says, to choose our own candidates, the right to have many parties, the right to pluralism. Heresy even under the liberalized Soviet society of Mikhail Gorbachev. One participant said the demonstration was only allowed because of the summit.
They're not afraid, as you see yourself, but nowadays it's much easier because of the presence of Mr. Reagan in Moscow and all those crews of correspondents here.
Gorbachev himself was quoted recently as saying his reforms have turned the Soviet Union into one big debating society. But the kind of anti-party line expressed by many of the dissidents here today is not the kind of debate he's yet prepared to tolerate. David Halton, CBC News, Moscow.
Coming up on The Journal.
The summit spirit. The Soviets can't seem to get enough. Gorbachev wants a bigger arms pact from Reagan.
Bolshoi Big Mac.
And Soviet consumers want Big Macs from America.
We don't mind to get high technology and to get pizza and McDonald's.
Can America handle those go-go Soviets? Coming up on The Journal.
At least 16 men working in a West German coal mine have been killed during a series of devastating explosions. The explosions caused heavy damage both below and above the ground. The main entrance to the mine was blown apart. It's thought the spontaneous ignition of coal dust is to blame. Many of the dead were foreign workers from Turkey, but at one point radio contact was made with some of those trapped and oxygen was pumped down. But now hope is fading that the 58 miners in the mine will be brought out alive. There are serious questions about a major item in Canada's naval rebuilding program. Part of a frigate project in St. John, New Brunswick, which is worth $3.2 billion, has missed several deadlines, and the opposition has raised doubts about the way some of the subcontracting jobs were handed out. Wendy Mesley reports.
God bless this ship and all who sail on her.
The first frigate in the fleet was christened by Mila Mulrooney in New Brunswick 2 weeks ago. The hull is complete, but many of the electronic components, the combat systems, have yet to be completed. A year ago, the major contractor, St. John's Shipbuilding, was afraid the whole project was in jeopardy because its major subcontractor, Paramax Electronics of Montreal, which builds those components, was far behind schedule. This information came to light in a series of internal company documents obtained by Liberal MP Brian Tobin.
I want to ask whether or not the government has instructed officials of Supply and Services to conduct regular audits to ensure that Paramax is and was fully in compliance with all government regulations.
The former Minister of Supply and Services says there has been no delay in the frigate program.
We are auditing the contract. To date, no irregularities have been uncovered. The honourable member has brought a situation to our attention, and I'll see that it's pursued to ensure that we're on course.
But Tobin has another document that shows that Paramax gave subcontracts worth almost $100 million to its American-based parent and to other associated firms without seeking any competitors for the bid. McGuinness says he doesn't think there's anything illegal about that.
They're set to a price. Whoever they contract after that is their business. They pay what they want. The government is only obligated to pay one price. That's set in the prime contract.
Tobin says it may not be illegal, but he wonders if the government's defense dollars have been properly spent.
We've all heard stories about contractors, defense contractors in the Pentagon, millions of dollars being wasted, contracts being padded.
He wonders if the same thing has now happened in Canada. Another of his documents shows that one of Paramax's subcontractors would make a 100% profit on its $3.3 million contract, a profit that Paramax thought was so unusual, it suspected the subcontractor of trying to manipulate the figures to avoid disclosing that.
The Department of Supply and Services still hasn't seen Tobin's secret documents. He says he'll pass them over tomorrow morning. At the same time, Tobin will deliver another copy of the documents to the RCMP. Wendy Mesley, CBC News, Ottawa.
There's new tension in an old dispute between Indians and the RCMP tonight. The police raided the Kahnawake Reserve just south of Montreal and arrested 17 people at gunpoint. The Indians, some of them armed, retaliated by blocking a 4-lane highway that runs through their reserve. The dispute is over cigarettes. Tony Ross reports.
The Mohawks reacted immediately to the RCMP raid. They blocked traffic all around the Kahnawake Reserve. One of Montreal's major bridges was closed. Expressways were empty because motorists couldn't reach them. This caused massive traffic tie-ups. At one point, the Indians dumped dirt on the road, making sure the traffic couldn't get through. Some of the Indians were armed. The RCMP says this is one of the reasons 200 men were used in the raid. 12 of the 17 arrested were released this afternoon. They say the police used excessive force.
Going up and all my back got scraped because he dragged on the gravel. He flipped me over. He put his foot on my back, and he put the machine gun on my head.
This man also says he had a gun pointed at his head.
They didn't have to put me on the floor like that. I'm not an animal.
The raid was made because of the Mohawk cigarette business. The Indians sell discount cigarettes. They refuse to pay taxes or duty, saying they aren't governed by federal laws. Today, the RCMP seized 400 cases of cigarettes, worth $450,000. The Mohawk leaders say the raid was an invasion of what they regard as a sacred territory.
We want our money back, and we want our merchandise back, and our people.
And all charges dropped against these individuals, all charges. And we are demanding a meeting with the people that are responsible of this invasion of our Mohawk territory.
This evening, about 250 of the Mohawk met in the Kahnawake Community Hall. They've decided to keep the road closed tonight and tomorrow, or until they meet with a representative from the federal government who can give them a good explanation about what happened. Tony Ross, CBC News, Kahnawake.
The blockade in Kahnawake comes at a time of growing frustration among Native people in Canada. That frustration was spelled out yesterday by the head of the country's biggest Native group. George Erasmus, who is the chief of the Assembly of First Nations, said Indians may soon be willing to use violence to press their demands. Today, other Indian chiefs said they agreed with that assessment. Whit Fraser reports.
Here in Edmonton, delegates at the National Native Assembly were quick to pass a resolution condemning the RCMP raid in Kahnawake. They also say blocking highways is just the kind of thing Native leaders are talking about when they say they're ready to resort to civil disobedience.
We would ask the Indian communities across the country to shut down some of the economic bloodlines of this country and show them that we're dissatisfied with the treatment that we're getting.
What's significant about George Erasmus' statement yesterday is that his warning of violence comes after such a long period of negotiations and relatively good relations with the federal government. On the surface, it looks as though the Native people have power. They get millions of dollars from the federal government. It helps to hold meetings like this one. They've even been able to hold a series of constitutional meetings with Ottawa. But none of that has changed the big picture. Most Native people still live in extreme poverty with the worst living conditions and lowest standard of education in the country.
If you put a civilized face on the uncivilized situations that our people find themselves in, somehow the message is lost, and we're not getting what we want done.
Many say the frustration now in the communities is evident in a staggering suicide rate and in alcoholism and family breakdown. But it's all directed inward. What Native leaders don't know is how long before it's directed to those outside the Native community, and that's the warning.
At some point in time, instead of continuously doing damage to yourself and collectively to yourself as a group, you have to take a stand and direct that anger somewhere else.
Erasmus and other Native leaders talk about possible violence, but they also fear it, not only because they see themselves as peaceful people, but also because they know that at the very first sign of violence, they'll lose the credibility that they've been able to establish over the past 20 years. Whit Fraser, CBC News, Edmonton.
A Canadian Soviet ski team has arrived at Ward Hunt Island in the Canadian Arctic 91 days after setting out from the northern tip of the Soviet Union. It's the first time anyone has made the 1,700-kilometer trip across the Arctic under their own power without vehicles or sled dogs. They reached the North Pole on April the 26th. A lot of of reaction today to a story we reported here on the National last night, a holdup in the federal government's plans for daycare funding. Ottawa had committed about $3 billion for a program that's billed as a key piece of social legislation. But it's become clear $3 billion won't match provincial expectations. And many people who work in daycare are wondering what happens next. Our social affairs specialist, Karen Webb, has the story.
The concern in Canadian daycares today, beyond that of play, lunch and more play, is what will happen if the federal government decides to change its childcare strategy. The provinces want to spend more than the federal government has allocated. Many people who work in daycare weren't surprised.
I don't know why, when there's so much manpower in Ottawa to solve these problems, they haven't been able to work it out. But it seemed quite obvious to anybody who looked at the numbers when they came out on December 3rd that they were inadequate.
Our key priorities. On December 3rd, Ottawa proposed a 7-year, $3 billion program the health minister said would double the number of daycare spaces. Now the government says it may have to limit the amount it spends, either by putting a ceiling on how much it will spend for each child in daycare or by limiting the amount it will spend in any province.
Some of my fears are that the government now, when push comes to shove and they're actually having to write the check, is finding it hard to do, that it's much more expensive than they planned. And in the interim, the children are being caught in the crossfire.
Advocates of a publicly funded daycare system have never liked this strategy. They say putting a ceiling on the program will make it fail.
There's no way of patching this up. Whatever is done, putting more money in it or anything is a Band-Aid. Any ceiling on expenditures creates a problem right away.
But there are provinces, and British Columbia is one, where childcare is not a priority, and government has spent very little money on it. The frustrated city of Vancouver put together its own task force to study the shortages.
We haven't yet convinced our provincial government to use it, even if it doesn't fall apart.
Now the city is worried Ottawa may try to change the proposal.
Political support at a provincial level is so tenuous that if the feds change the percent at all and require any extra from the provinces, we'll get nothing.
When the child care strategy was announced, federal officials said it was designed deliberately so that Ottawa could control how much it spent. There are no signs that has changed, so whatever decision is made about funding, it is highly unlikely it will be simply to spend as much money as the provinces want. Karen Webb, CBC News, Vancouver.